Washington County, Maine, November 14th, 1979, 4:22 a.m. The M here doesn't just get cold, it turns into a blade. It smells of salt, rotting kelp, and the dying breath of the Atlantic. Along Route 191, where the pines grow so thick they seem to be strangling the road, the only sound should have been the rhythmic thrum of the tide hitting the jagged granite cliffs. But that morning, the silence was broken by something unnatural. A 1978 Plymouth Fury, its blue and white paint dulled by a layer of coastal frost, sat idling in the middle of the asphalt. The driver's side door swung open, rhythmically hitting the doorframe with a metallic clack, clack, clack. A funeral drum for the man lying beside it. State Trooper Elias Vance didn't die quickly. He lay in the slush of the shoulder, his crisp uniform stained a dark, steaming crimson that melted the ice beneath him. His hand was still inches away from his service revolver, but his eyes, wide and clouded with the sudden realization of mortality, were fixed on the gray Maine sky. He had been hit from 400 yards. A single .30-06 round that had traveled through the morning mist with the surgical precision of a ghost. Inside the cruiser, the radio hissed with static, a frantic voice from the Machias barracks calling for a check-in that would never be answered. 10 miles away, in the small fishing village of Cutler, the Kavanagh family sat in total darkness. They weren't sleeping, they weren't hiding, they were waiting. Patrick, the patriarch, held a brass shell casing in his calloused palm, the metal still warm against his skin. To the law, this was the start of a massacre. To the Kavanaghs, it was simply the first payment on a debt that had been signed in blood 6 weeks ago. In these woods, the law of the state stopped where the tree line began. And that morning, the trees were screaming for vengeance.
In 1979, Washington County was a place where time didn't flow, it eroded. The residents of Cutler didn't measure their lives in years, but in seasons of harvest, lobster in the summer, wood in the winter, and grief whenever the Atlantic decided it was time to collect. It was a landscape of jagged granite and black spruce, where the fog was so thick you could feel it in your lungs, tasting of brine and old iron. The village was a cluster of weathered clapboard houses, their white paint stripped away by decades of salt-laden winds, leaving them gray and skeletal against the backdrop of a leaden sea. The Kavanagh homestead sat on the farthest edge of the point, a house built of cedar and stubbornness in 1912. It smelled of things that never quite dried, damp wool, wood smoke, and the sharp metallic tang of motor oil. In the yard, rusted lobster traps were stacked like ancient ruins, and the skeleton of an old Ford truck sat sinking into the mud, its tires long since surrendered to the frost. This wasn't a place for the faint of heart. The ground was too rocky for farming, the sea too violent for safety, and the people too proud for charity. Life for a Kavanagh began at 3:30 a.m. It was a ritual of silence. Patrick Kavanagh, a man whose skin looked like tanned leather and whose hands were permanently stained by the dyes of buoy paint and the grease of marine engines, would sit in the kitchen before dawn. The only light came from the glowing orange coil of an electric stove. There was no soft conversation here. The language of the Maine coast was a language of nods, grunts, and the steady strike of a match against a box. They wore heavy flannel shirts over thermal wool, clothes that felt like armor against the relentless humidity of the North Atlantic. The economy of the coast was collapsing in '79. Fuel prices were skyrocketing, and the big commercial trawlers from Portland and Boston were moving into the local waters, scraping the ocean floor clean, and leaving the small-time fishermen with nothing but empty traps and rising debts. You could see the desperation in the lines of the men standing outside the general store, men who had spent 20 years on the water and were now watching their world be sold off piece by piece to satisfy banks they had never visited. But the Kavanaghs didn't complain. They were a closed circuit. They fixed their own engines, mended their own nets, and settled their own scores. In the village, they were respected, not because they were friendly, but because they were constant. They were as much a part of the landscape as the cliffs of Quoddy Head. When a Kavanagh gave his word, it was as solid as the stone beneath their feet. And when they felt a grievance, it wasn't a spark that flared and died, it was a slow-burning coal,
buried deep under the ash, waiting for a breath of wind to turn it into an inferno. The kitchen table was the heart of their world, a massive slab of oak scarred by knives and stained by spilled coffee. It was here that the boys, Liam, Sean, and Owen, learned the history of their blood. They weren't taught about the kings of Ireland. They were taught about the grandfather who survived the 1927 gale by tying himself to the mast, and the uncle who died in the woods of the Ardennes because he wouldn't leave a wounded friend behind. To the outsiders, the state troopers who rolled in from Augusta in their polished cruisers, the Kavanaghs were just local color, backward, uneducated men with thick accents and dirty fingernails. They didn't see the complexity of the knots they tied, or the precision with which they could navigate a boat through a blind fog by the sound of the surf alone. They didn't understand that in a place this hard, family wasn't just a social unit, it was a survival pact. If you struck one, you struck them all, and if you killed one, you invited the entire weight of the Atlantic's darkness into your home.
Conor Kavanagh was 17 years old, and in a family built of granite and iron, he was the only thing that resembled light. While his brothers, Liam and Sean, had bodies hardened by the repetitive trauma of the logging camps and the lobster boats, Conor still carried a certain leanness, a boyish agility that made him look younger than his years. He had the same dark, curly hair as his mother, who had passed away from pneumonia during the harsh winter of '74, and eyes the color of the Atlantic after a storm. He was the only one of Patrick's sons who ever talked about leaving, not because he hated the coast, but because his mind worked differently. He was a tinkerer, a boy who could take apart a broken watch or a seized outboard motor and find the one microscopic flaw that stopped the gears from turning. He spent his evenings on the pier, not drinking beer with the older men, but sketching designs for a more efficient hydraulic hoist for the traps. Patrick watched him with a mixture of pride and fear. He knew that the boy was too gentle for the life they lived, yet he was a Kavanagh, through and through, loyal to a fault and incapable of dishonesty. On the evening of September 28, 1979, the air was unusually still. The smell of wood smoke from the village chimneys hung low over the water, trapped by a heavy atmospheric ceiling. Conor had spent 14 hours on the Marianne, his father's boat, pulling traps until his knuckles were raw and bleeding from the salt spray. He had earned his keep that day, and Patrick had given him $5 and the keys to the old family truck to head into town for a hot meal and a movie. He stopped at The Anchor's End, a small roadside diner on the edge of Machias. It was a place where the floorboards were permanently sticky with spilled soda, and the air was thick with the grease of the deep fryer. Conor was sitting at the counter, nursing a coffee and a slice of apple pie, his mind likely miles away, perhaps thinking about the engineering books he'd ordered by mail from the University of Maine. He didn't notice the two state troopers come in. They weren't locals. They were Augusta boys, sent up to the coast for a 2-week rotation to crack down on the lawlessness of the fishing villages. Trooper Miller and Trooper Vance, the same Vance who would later end up in the slush of Route 191, felt like kings in their crisp, pressed uniforms and polished leather. They looked at the weathered men in the diner with a condescension that was as thick as the gravy on the plates. The conflict started over nothing. A word, a look, a misunderstanding of the local dialect. Miller made a comment about the smell of fish and poverty that permeated the room. Conor, who had been raised to never let a slur against his family or his trade go unanswered, didn't yell. He didn't start a fight. He simply looked Miller in the eye and said, "If you don't like the smell of the work that pays your salary, officer, maybe you should find a desk in the city." It was a quiet remark, but it cut deep. In front of a dozen locals, the young trooper felt his authority challenged by a kid with dirty fingernails. There was no crime committed, no law broken, but in that moment, the ego of the state collided with the pride of the coast. Miller didn't ask for identification. He didn't issue a warning. He simply grabbed Conor by the collar of his wool jacket and dragged him toward the door, claiming he was interfering with an officer's peace. As they stepped out into the gravel parking lot, the cold night air hit them. Conor tried to pull away, not to fight, but instinctively, out of the sheer confusion of why he was being touched. To Miller, that was resisting. To Vance, who stood by and watched, it was a chance to teach the local trash a lesson about who held the power. They didn't see a 17-year-old boy with a talent for mechanics and a heart full of dreams. They saw a Kavanagh, a name associated with stubbornness and defiance. They didn't take him to the county jail. They took him to a small secondary substation 3 miles down the road, a concrete block building with no cameras and no witnesses. That night, the sound of the ocean was drowned out by the sound of heavy boots hitting ribs, and the quietest of the Kavanagh boys learned that in the eyes of the law, his life was worth less than the ink on a citation. The Machias substation was a tomb of cold concrete and flickering fluorescent light, tucked away from the main road where the trees grew thick and the ground stayed damp year-round. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of floor wax and the metallic tang of old radiator steam. They threw Conor into a 6x8 holding cell at the back of the building. There were no other prisoners, just the hollow echo of a heavy steel door slamming shut and the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet down the hall. For the first hour, Conor sat on the wooden bench, his chest burning with every breath. Miller's boots had cracked 2 of his ribs, and a deep, pulsing ache had settled behind his left eye where he'd been slammed against the cruiser's roof. He wasn't crying, he was waiting, still believing in the logic of the world he knew, that someone would come, that his father would explain the mistake, and that the truth would be enough to set him free. But the Augusta boys weren't interested in the truth. In the front office, Trooper Miller sat with a cup of burnt coffee, his knuckles bruised and his temper still simmering. He knew he'd gone too far. He saw the way the kid's head had bounced off the concrete floor of the garage. He saw the shallow, uneven rhythm of Conor's breathing. Instead of calling for a medic, he chose silence. He and Vance filled out a report that painted a picture of a drunken, combative local who had fallen during a struggle. A narrative was being built, brick by brick, to bury a 17-year-old boy. Around 2 a.m., the temperature in the cell dropped. Conor's internal injuries were beginning to manifest. A slow, silent bleed in his brain, the result of a skull fracture from the initial arrest, was starting to put pressure on his gray matter. He began to drift. He wasn't in a cell anymore. In his mind, he was back on the Marianne, the boat swaying gently under a summer moon, the sound of the water against the hull as soft as a lullaby. He reached out his hand to grab a buoy that wasn't there, his fingers brushing against the cold, damp stone of the cell wall. He called out for his father, a raspy, whispered, "Da," but the only response was the hum of the overhead lights. By 3:30 a.m., Conor's breathing changed. It became heavy, erratic, the sound of a body struggling to remember how to live. It's a sound that haunts the dreams of those who hear it, a desperate rattling for air that the lungs can no longer process. Trooper Vance walked back to the cells once during the night. He stood at the bars, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He saw Conor slumped in the corner, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, a dark fluid leaking from his nose and ears. Vance felt a cold spike of panic in his gut. He didn't open the door. He didn't check for a pulse. He turned off his flashlight, walked back to the front desk, and told Miller, "The kid's finally quiet." When the morning shift arrived at 6 a.m., they found Conor Kavanagh cold. He lay on the floor of the cell, his hands curled as if he were still trying to fix that outboard motor, his eyes open but seeing nothing of this world. The official report would later state that he died of complications from a fall while in a state of high agitation. The word murder was never typed. The word justice was never spoken. By 8 a.m., a local deputy, a man who had known Patrick Kavanagh for 30 years, was driving up the long muddy lane to the Kavanagh homestead. He didn't use his siren. He didn't even want to get out of the car. He saw Patrick standing on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand, looking out at the Atlantic. Patrick didn't need to be told. He saw the deputy's face, saw the way he wouldn't meet his eyes, and he knew that the light of his family had been extinguished in the dark of a state cell. The deputy spoke the words, but Patrick didn't hear them. He just felt the wind shift. It was blowing from the north now, a cold, unrelenting gale that promised a long, bitter winter. He walked inside, put his coffee mug on the oak table, and looked at his 3 older sons. There was no shouting, no wailing, just a silence so heavy it felt like it would crack the foundation of the house. "They killed him," Patrick said, his voice as dry as dead leaves. "They killed our boy, and they're going to call it an accident." Liam, the oldest, stood up and walked to the corner of the room where the gun rack sat. He reached for his .306, the wood of the stock smooth and familiar in his hands. He didn't ask what they were going to do. He knew. In the state of Maine, there was the law of the books, and then there was the law of the Kavanaghs, and the books had just been closed. The air inside the Washington County Courthouse in Machias was thick with the smell of floor wax and old, dusty paper. It was October 15th, 2 weeks after Conor had been buried in the rocky soil of the family plot. Patrick Kavanagh sat on a hard wooden bench in the hallway, his back as straight as a mast, his sons, Liam, Sean, and Owen, flanking him like silent sentinels. They wore their best suits, ill-fitting, smelling of mothballs and long-buried grief, but their hands, calloused and stained by the sea, betrayed them. When the doors to the hearing room opened, the air seemed to leave the lungs of everyone in the hallway. Out walked the county coroner, a man named Dr. Aristothal, who had spent too many years looking at the dead to care much for the living.
followed by the state police legal representative. They didn't look at Patrick. They looked over him, as if he were just another piece of the coastal landscape, a nuisance to be cleared away. The inquest had lasted less than an hour. No witnesses from the diner were called. No mention was made of the bruised knuckles on Trooper Muller's hands. The formal finding was read with the cold, rhythmic monotony of a weather report. Death by natural causes, precipitated by acute cerebral edema following a traumatic incident of self-inflicted origin during a period of high emotional distress. In plain English, the state was saying that Conor had killed himself by being too upset. Patrick stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. "My son didn't have a heart condition," he said, his voice low, vibrating with a frequency that made the glass in the hallway windows hum. "He didn't fall. He was 17, and he could outrun a deer in the brush. You're telling me he just stopped breathing because he was distressed?" The state police representative, a man in a suit that cost more than Patrick's boat, adjusted his glasses. "The matter is closed, Mr. Kavanagh." He wasn't in uniform today. He was in civilian clothes, looking relaxed, even smirking as he shared a quiet joke with a colleague. He caught Patrick's eye for a fleeting second, a look of pure, unadulterated arrogance. It was the look of a man who knew he was protected by the weight of the state, a man who believed that a badge was a license to erase a life and walk away with a clean conscience. Liam stepped forward, his fists clenching so hard the veins in his forearms threatened to burst, but Patrick's hand shot out, gripping his son's shoulder with the strength of a heavy-duty winch. "Not here," the father whispered. They walked out of the courthouse and into the biting October wind. The sky was a bruised purple, and the first flakes of an early snow were beginning to swirl in the air. They stood in the gravel parking lot, watching the state police cruisers pull away, their tires kicking up dust that settled on the Kavanagh's worn-out boots. "The law has spoken," Owen said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "No," Patrick replied, his eyes tracking Miller's car until it disappeared around the bend. "That wasn't the law. That was a lie told in a room with no windows. The law is what happens when a man has to look another man in the eye and account for what he's done." He turned to his sons. "Go to the hardware store, buy 3 cases of 30-06 Springfield, get the heavy grain, and tell the boys at the pier that the Kavanaghs won't be out on the water for a while. We have work to do in the woods." That night, for the first time in 60 years, the lights in the Kavanagh house didn't go out at 9 p.m. They stayed on until dawn, casting long, jagged shadows against the pines. The Augusta boys thought they had closed a file. They didn't realize they had just opened a hunt.
The attic of the old Kavanagh house was a place of ghosts and heavy timber. It was where Patrick kept the things too painful for the main floor: his wife's sewing machine, Conor's childhood drawings, and the heavy iron footlocker that belonged to his own father. On the night of October 20th, the 4 men gathered there, lit only by a single kerosene lantern that threw flickering, monstrous shadows against the rafters. The table in the center was covered with topographical maps of Washington County, maps that showed every deer trail, every abandoned logging road, and every blind curve on Route 19-1. Patrick didn't look like a fisherman anymore. He looked like a general. He laid out 4 rifles on the table, Remington 700s, bolt action, rugged and reliable. These weren't weapons of war. They were tools for the Maine woods, capable of dropping a moose at 300 yards in a gale. "We are not murderers," Patrick said, his voice echoing in the cramped space. "Murder is what they did to Conor in the dark. What we are doing is balancing the scales. We don't touch civilians. We don't touch their families. We target the uniform. We target the institution that decided our boy was worth less than their paperwork." He pointed to a spot on the map, a narrow bottleneck where Route 19-1 squeezed between a steep granite ridge and a cedar swamp. "This is where they feel safe. This is where they go 80 miles an hour because they think they own the road. We're going to show them that they only own the asphalt. The woods belong to us." The plan was a dark masterpiece of local knowledge. They wouldn't just shoot. They would psychologically dismantle the patrol routes. They would use the fog, the early winter darkness, and the silence of the coast to turn the state police's own technology against them. Liam, the veteran of the family, explained the ballistics, how the cold air would drop the bullet, how the wind off the Atlantic would push it 3 inches to the left. "They'll call for help," Sean said, leaning into the light. "The minute the first one goes down, the whole state will descend on us." "Let them come," Patrick said. "By the time they realize they're in a fight, we'll be ghosts. We don't stay and fight their war. We move like the tide. We hit, we vanish, we let the forest swallow us whole. They think their badges make them invincible. We're going to show them that lead doesn't care about a badge. Each son took a rifle. There was no oath, no dramatic speech. They simply checked the bolts, felt the weight of the steel, and looked at their father. In that attic, the Kavanagh family ceased to be citizens of the United States. They became a clan, a primitive, unstoppable force of nature, driven by the oldest motivation in human history, the blood of a child spilled on the ground. As the lantern flickered out, the only sound left was the distant, rhythmic pounding of the Atlantic against the cliffs, a sound that for the first time seemed to be keeping time with the beating of their hearts.
The first week of November brought a frost that turned the Maine woods into a cathedral of glass. The ground was frozen solid, crunching like bone underfoot. The Kavanaghs moved through the forest with a silence that was almost supernatural. They didn't use trucks. They moved on foot, carrying their gear in weathered canvas rucksacks, avoiding the main trails where a stray hunter or a deputy might spot them. They chose the Devil's Throat, a stretch of Route 191 where the road bends sharply around a massive outcropping of granite known as the Widow's Stone. On one side, a 60-foot drop to the churning Atlantic. On the other, a dense, dark slope of hemlock and spruce. It was a kill zone designed by nature. Patrick and Liam spent 3 days preparing the obstruction. They didn't use a flashy roadblock. They used a deadfall, a massive, lightning-scarred pine that they partially sawed through at the base, held in place by a complex system of ropes and pulleys hidden in the brush. With one pull of a lever, 2 tons of timber would bridge the road, looking like a natural accident caused by the heavy coastal winds. They didn't just plan for the shooting, they planned for the aftermath. Sean and Owen established spider holes, small camouflaged pits lined with cedar boughs and topped with frames of living moss. From these positions 50 feet above the road, a man could lie for 10 hours in total invisibility, his rifle barrel barely poking through the needles. They mapped out 3 separate lines of retreat, each leading to a different cold cache of food and ammunition buried months ago in anticipation of a hard winter. On the night of November 13th, the fog rolled in, a pea souper that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet. Patrick stood on the ridge, looking down at the empty highway. He checked his watch. 3:15 a.m. The shift change for the McCass-Bonce was 45 minutes away. Trooper Elias Vance, the man who had stood by and watched Conor die, would be the first one on patrol. "Check your zeros," Patrick whispered into the darkness. Beside him, Liam adjusted the turret on his scope. The brothers were separated by 200 yards, but they worked as a single organism. There was no hesitation in their movements, no tremors in their hands. The grief that had consumed them for 6 weeks had crystallized into something cold, hard, and perfectly functional. They weren't just waiting for a car. They were waiting for the arrival of their own destiny. They knew that once the first shot was fired, the lives they had known, the boats, the village, the quiet mornings on the pier, were over. They were no longer men. They were the embodiment of the mountain's grudge. As the first faint light of a gray dawn began to bleed through the fog, the distant, high-pitched whine of a high-performance engine echoed up from the south. The hunt had begun. The headlights of the 1978 Plymouth Fury cut through the mist like twin yellow ghosts. Trooper Elias Vance was driving fast, his mind likely on the warm breakfast waiting for him at the end of his shift. He was humming a tune he'd heard on the radio, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, completely oblivious to the 4 pairs of eyes tracking his every move from the shadows of the hemlocks. As the cruiser hit the apex of the curve at the Devil's Throat, Patrick signaled. With a sharp crack of breaking rope, the deadfall pine swung down. It didn't hit the car, but it slammed across the asphalt 20 feet in front of it with a ground-shaking thud. Vance reacted instinctively, slamming on his brakes. The cruiser skidded, the smell of burning rubber filling the damp air, and came to a halt inches from the trunk of the fallen tree. Vance sat in the cabin for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs. He swore under his breath, reaching for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14. I've got a major deadfall blocking both lanes at mile marker 82. I'm going to need a crew with some saws." He stepped out of the car, adjusting his gun belt, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He walked toward the tree, his boots crunching on the frost. He didn't look at the ridge. He didn't look at the trees. He was looking at the wood, wondering if he could move it himself. 400 yards up the slope, Patrick Kavanagh exhaled, his lungs emptying in a slow, controlled stream. He felt the cold steel of the trigger against his finger. He didn't see a man. He saw the face of the state that had called his son's death and accident. He centered the crosshairs on the silver badge pinned to Vance's chest. "For Conor," Patrick whispered. The report of the 30-06 was a sharp, whip-like crack that tore the morning silence to shreds. The bullet, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, crossed the distance in a heartbeat.
It struck Vance exactly where the badge met the fabric. The force of the impact lifted the trooper off his feet and threw him backward against the hood of his cruiser. Vance didn't scream. The air had been punched out of him instantly. He slumped down the side of the car, his hands clawing feebly at the cold metal, leaving a dark, steaming smear of crimson behind. His eyes were wide, looking up at the gray sky, trying to understand why the world had suddenly turned so cold. Liam fired the second shot. It wasn't necessary, but it was a mercy. The bullet struck the engine block of the cruiser, severing the fuel line and shattering the distributor cap. The car died with a metallic wheeze, the headlights flickering out and leaving the scene in a haunting, half-lit gloom. The radio inside the car hissed. "Unit 14, did you copy? We have a crew on standby. Unit 14, come in." There was no answer, only the sound of the Atlantic crashing against the rocks below and the slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of blood hitting the frozen asphalt. The first payment had been made, but the Kavanaghs weren't finished. They knew the radio call would bring more. They knew the silence of the woods was about to be replaced by the roar of a war they had started, and they were ready to finish it.
The silence that followed Vance's death lasted exactly 6 minutes. Then the forest began to vibrate. From the north, the scream of 2 more sirens tore through the fog, Unit 9 and Unit 22, driving like hell toward the last known coordinates of their fallen brother. The Kavanaghs didn't stay at the first sight. As soon as Vance hit the ground, they melted back into the shadows. They didn't run. They moved with a steady, rhythmic pace, like a pack of timber wolves. They used ghost trails, old deer paths that were invisible to anyone not born in Washington County. When the 2 backup cruisers arrived at the Devil's Throat, the scene was a nightmare. The troopers saw the deadfall, the bullet-riddled Plymouth, and Vance's body cooling on the asphalt. Panic, sharp and metallic, set in. They did exactly what Patrick knew they would do. They spilled out of their cars, seeking cover behind the doors, their eyes frantically scanning the thick tree line. But the Kavanaghs weren't there anymore. They were 300 yards to the east, positioned in a semicircle on a higher ridge. "Now," Patrick signaled. The woods erupted. This wasn't a firefight, it was an execution. Liam and Sean opened fire from the flanks, their rounds punching through the thin sheet metal of the police cruisers as if it were paper. The troopers were pinned. Every time an officer tried to reach for his radio or aim a shotgun, a .30-06 round would hum past his ear or shatter the glass inches from his head. They weren't aiming to kill everyone at once. They were aiming for the tires, the radiators, and the radio antennas. They were systematically stripping the state of its mobility and its communication. One trooper, a young man from Portland who had only been on the job for 6 months, tried to bolt for the safety of a nearby ditch. Sean's rifle barked once. The boy went down, clutching his leg, his screams echoing off the granite cliffs. The Kavanaghs didn't finish him. They left him screaming. It was a cold, brutal calculation. A wounded man requires 2 others to carry him. It slowed the enemy down. It turned their own humanity against them. By the time the troopers managed to return fire, aiming blindly into the dense hemlocks, the Kavanaghs were gone again. They slipped through a hidden ravine, their gray wool sweaters making them invisible against the mist and the stone. To the state police, it felt like the forest itself was shooting at them. They were fighting ghosts who knew exactly where the moss was slippery and where the ground was firm. By midday, the town of Cutler was no longer a fishing village. It was an occupied territory. Over 50 vehicles, state police, FBI, and National Guard clogged the narrow streets. Men in tactical gear and helmets marched past the general store, their boots loud and foreign on the wooden boardwalks. A command center was set up at the town hall. Special Agent Raymond Cross, a man with cold eyes and a heart of bureaucracy, began the interrogations. He brought in the locals one by one, the men Conor had grown up with, the women who had baked bread for his mother's funeral. "Where are the Kavanaghs?" Cross asked, slamming a photo of Patrick on the table. The response was always the same: a slow blink, a long pull on a hand-rolled cigarette, a shrug of the shoulders. "Haven't seen him," old Pete, the harbor master, said. "Suppose they're out on the water. It's lobster season, ain't it?" "Their boats are in the harbor, Pete. We checked," Cross hissed. "Well then," Pete replied, looking out the window at the gray Atlantic. "Maybe they're in the woods. People get lost in the woods of Maine all the time. Sometimes they don't want to be found." It was a wall of silence. Not a single person in Cutler mentioned the rifles they knew Patrick kept. No one mentioned the attic meetings. The village had made its choice. They had seen Conor's bruised body at the funeral. They had seen the arrogance of the Augusta boys for years. In the eyes of the coast,
The Kavanaghs weren't fugitives. They were the town's own hands, finally doing the work that the law refused to do. The police tried to push, threatening arrests for obstruction, but you can't arrest a whole town. The locals just stared back with eyes as hard as the granite cliffs, a silent, collective no that frustrated the FBI more than any ambush. The state had the guns and the radios, but the Kavanaghs had the heart of the people.
November 15th brought the gale of the century. The Atlantic rose up in a fury, waves 50 feet high crashing against the base of the Little River lighthouse. The wind screamed at 80 miles an hour, turning the rain into needles that drew blood. The Kavanaghs were trapped. The state had finally used infrared from a low-flying military chopper during a brief break in the clouds. They were pinned at the lighthouse, a white stone tower at the very edge of the world. Over 100 officers surrounded the base of the peninsula. They brought in armored trucks and tear gas. Special Agent Cross stood behind a bulletproof shield, a megaphone in his hand. "Patrick Kavanagh, it's over! You have nowhere to go but the sea! Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands above your head!" Inside the lighthouse, the air was freezing. The brothers stood on the spiral staircase, their ammunition boxes nearly empty. Patrick looked at Liam, Sean, and Owen. Their faces were hollow, their eyes red from exhaustion, but their hands were steady. "We did what we came for," Patrick said, the sound of the storm nearly drowning out his voice. "Miller is dead. Vance is dead. The men who took Conor know our names now." "What now, Da?" Owen asked. He was the youngest left, and for a second Patrick saw a flash of Conor in his eyes. Patrick looked at the heavy iron door. He could hear the officers moving up the path. He didn't want his sons to die in a cage. He didn't want them to be paraded in front of cameras in Portland, stripped of their dignity. "We don't surrender to men who don't know the value of a life," Patrick said. He picked up his rifle and stood by the door. "We go out into the wind. We go out like Kavanaghs." The door burst open. The flash of a dozen stun grenades turned the interior of the lighthouse into a blinding white void. The brothers didn't hunker down. They charged into the light, rifles barking, a final, defiant roar against the machinery of the state. The firefight lasted less than 90 seconds. In the chaos of smoke and salt spray, the Kavanagh men fell one by one, their blood mixing with the seawater that flooded the floor. Patrick was the last to go down, a dozen rounds catching him in the chest. He fell backward, his head resting against the stone wall his grandfather had helped build. As his vision faded, the last thing he heard wasn't the gunfire or the shouting of the police. It was the sound of the Atlantic, the deep, eternal pulse of the ocean, calling its sons home. The following morning, the sun rose over a world that felt fundamentally altered. The state police had withdrawn, leaving behind nothing but yellow tape fluttering in the wind and the scarred, bullet-pocked asphalt of Route 191. 9 officers had been lost. A family had been erased. In Augusta, the politicians stood behind mahogany podiums, their voices trembling with manufactured outrage. The media called it the Coastal Massacre, branding the Kavanaghs as domestic terrorists and primitive holdouts of a lawless era. They promised more funding for tactical gear and harsher penalties for anyone who dared to challenge a badge. They tried to turn the Kavanaghs into monsters, faceless killers who had chosen violence over the civility of the court. But in Cutler, the narrative was etched in stone, not ink. Along the docks, on every lobster boat and every weathered pier, the flags weren't just lowered, they were missing, a silent coastal sign of mourning that no outsider could decipher. At the family plot, 3 new crosses made of salt-cured oak appeared overnight next to Conor's grave. There were no names carved into them, only the word Kavanagh. The state records will always say that Patrick and his sons were criminals. But if you sit in the dim light of a Washington County tavern, when the fog is thick and the tourists are gone, the old men will tell you a different truth. They'll tell you about a boy who was too gentle for the salt, and a father who refused to let his son's life be reduced to a footnote in a coroner's lie. They don't talk about the killing. They talk about the cost. They talk about how, in the state of Maine, justice isn't a thing found in a courthouse with marble floors. Justice is something you have to carve out of the granite yourself, with a steady hand and a soul prepared for the consequences. The Atlantic still beats against the cliffs, relentless and unforgiving. It washes away the blood, it erodes the stone, and it buries the secrets of the deep. But it can never drown out the memory. Because in these woods, a debt of blood is the only debt that is ever truly settled.